commandment, which is page 15 in your satchels, or whatever you want to talk about it. Okay, and we have some passages from all the way from Genesis all the way to the New Testament. So volunteer for Genesis 2, please. Yes, ma'am, go.
All right. Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden, cultivated and keep it.
Okay, so cultivate it and keep it. And of course, that would be called work, wouldn't it? Yeah. All right. So the next passage is Psalm 37:21. Go, Kurt.
The wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives.
Okay, so believers give, the unbelievers borrow. But especially borrow and remain in debt. Psalm 104.
I have it.
Go.
He causes the grass to grow for the cattle, and vegetation for the labor of man, so that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine which makes man's heart glad, so that he may make his face glisten with oil, and food which sustains man's heart.
All right, so God provides. And He provides all kinds of things, not just stuff that grows by itself, but also gives man the ability to work, gives him labor, gives him jobs, gives him talents and abilities, and so on and so forth. And his gifts, of course, cover a wide range of things, including wine and other such enjoyables, I guess you could call them. Matthew 5.
Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you.
Okay, so to give and to allow or let borrow is something believers need to be doing. Ephesians 4. Yes, ma'am.
He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need.
God has something against theft. He does not like people to take things that do not belong to them. Philippians 2. Go.
Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others.
Okay. So, as with many of the other commandments, others are very, very important in this too. Okay? So, you look at all these things together, and what does this tell you about God's viewpoint when it comes to the things of this world, to material stuff?
Share.
Share? Good. What else?
God provides it all.
God gives it, God makes it, God creates it, God gives it freely. We should share freely. Anything else? On the negative side, what would you say?
Don't take from others.
Yeah, keep your hands to yourself. Keep your work with what you have. If you have to borrow. Of course, that's the way our world is made today. Not so much millennia ago, but today you can't really function too much without borrowing. But other than that, don't take from other people, don't cheat other people. That would be included in this as well. Okay? So don't get for yourself in a dishonest way. Yes. In a dishonest way. So, first question: what is the origin of all property and wealth in the world? God. Right. What word answer? Don't need any more than that. Who's the real owner of all of these things? God too. Again, not just makes it, but it's still His, even though He gives it to us. So, what we have, our house, our cars, our property, land, whatever, we think of it as ours, but it's really not. It's still God's. God not only makes it, but it still belongs to Him we basically just rent it or lease it or however you want to put it. Who decides who will be rich and who will be poor? God, again. Okay? Now, this does not mean that we are totally without responsibility. God, a part of that whole will of God that we talked about previously, and how God works through people, He does give people a certain amount of decision-making ability. Okay? Of course, we know that unbelievers don't really have free will. Whatever they do for themselves or to save themselves or whatever. And this, of course, is not God-pleasing. However, in the course of trying to save themselves, or in the course of trying to appease God in an ungodly or unpleasing way, they will, and God will allow them to do things which will benefit us, that will benefit the believers. On the other hand, believers can also, they do have a certain amount of free will, call it 50% if you want, or something like that, but they have about, and so believers can decide good and bad things. They can decide to use their talents and abilities to the best of their ability for others, to feed their families, or if nothing else, I mean, even single people, if nothing else, they can use their gifts and talents. Just putting them to use at all is in a way of showing gratefulness and glory to God. Just the fact that they're using their talents, even if they're basically just taking care of themselves. But then, of course, in our society too, we have the government that extracts taxes, whether we like to or not. And so even the single person certainly does things for the benefit of society. All right. So, and a believer can make the decision not to do anything. Believer can make the decision, which would be not a God-pleasing decision, of course, but a believer, it's possible for a believer to make the decision not to work, or not to work efficiently or effectively, just as it is capable of course, for the unbeliever to decide that. It is, while it is God who ultimately is the one responsible for who is billionaires and who is poverty-stricken, at the same time, the poor certainly bear some responsibility on their own. And just as the rich do. Some of the rich get rich in an unjust way. I don't necessarily say illegal way, but in an unjust way, an unchristian way, an unbiblical way. The laws of our nation don't necessarily match up with the Bible word for word, or concept for concept. And so there are things in our law that are allowed to people that may or may not necessarily be a part of God's will. Okay? So there is possible that a person could become a very, very rich person, and really this is perhaps a misuse. A part of this is a misuse of God's gift, so that's possible too. So there is some personal responsibility, and we can see examples of that in the Bible. Of course, maybe the most famous example is Jesus telling the parable of the talents. And the guys who went out and made the talents grow, that is, the talent was a coinage or money, and made that money grow and whatever, and the one other guy put it in the ground and buried it because he was afraid he might lose a little or something. And so what does that show? That now, what did Jesus say? It not only showed laziness, okay, it showed disrespect. Jesus, said, well, you could have at least put it in the bank and got some interest on it, at least. You didn't even bother to do that. And then you were so scared that I would hold you responsible for something that happened to it. Maybe it wasn't even your fault. This comes down a lot of times to trust too. There's a thin line, and I'm not sure you can describe it real well, perhaps, or I don't think you can maybe find a Bible passage for it, but there is a thin line between foolhardiness in your investments and trust in God in your investments. Okay? You can say, well, I'm just going to buy nothing but blue chip stocks. Okay, that's not really much of a gamble. Sure, they go down once in a while, but in general they don't. And I remember asking my investment counselor and fiduciary at one point, is there a fund that is made up only of the Dow Jones Industrials? And she said, yeah, oh yeah. And some of her clients, that's what they have all their money in. And that way, when the Dow goes up or down, they know exactly what's happening to their investments that day. And I asked her, I said, do you advise this? And she goes, no, I don't advise it. It's just what they like because they like their investments to be simple. So that's not much of a gamble. That's you can do that and still put a lot of trust in God. Foolhardiness, on the other hand, is certainly possible. Putting your money in an oil well in Nigeria, I don't know. That's probably kind of silly. It's probably kind of foolish. And the Lord doesn't give a promise anywhere that that's going to necessarily work out. Okay? So, again, I can't tell anybody, I can't tell you, certainly I don't have enough knowledge even in the market to tell you which is foolish investment and which is not. I think we kind of know in many cases. If you're going to follow Warren Buffett, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. If you're going to follow some fly-by-night guy, you're probably sticking your neck out unnecessarily. But in the end, again, it is God who makes the poor, and it is God who makes the rich. Because without God's allowance for those investments to pay off, or without God's allowance for those oil wells to fail, and investments to die down and be worth nothing, without God's allowance, then there's nothing's going to happen one way or the other. So it is God's responsibility and focus. What is God's view of work?
It is good and honorable.
Yeah, well, work is good. To have a job is good. I was re-watching a fascinating movie once again. I watch it about every couple of years just for fun. George Lucas' very first film and his doctoral thesis in motion picture class at USC, which was named THX 1138. And constantly in that movie, the speakers are telling people all the time, it is good to have a job. You should be happy if you have a job, you have work. And this is a real big deal with them. It's kind of a fascinating picture of the future. I have to laugh because it's the future in the early 2000s. but it's George was a little bit ahead of his time, I guess you might say. In any case, work is good. Work is not bad. Work can certainly be bad in the sense of boring, repetitive. You can certainly have bad bosses. You can certainly have bad coworkers. You have coworkers who steal, or coworkers who are lazy, who stick you with a lot of work. I mean, there's all kinds of things in labor and work that can be bad. There's no question about that. I'm not arguing that point. I don't think God argues that. But again, the talents and abilities to be able to function in a job is a gift of God, and we need to look upon it that way. And good hard work, whether it's mental work or whether it's physical work, is certainly a gift and blessing from the Lord. No question about that. All right, what is God's will concerning our making a living in this world? What does He want us to do?
He wants us to work and make our own way.
Yeah, He wants us. Yeah, He wants us to make our own way. That's the answer. He wants us to make our own way. Again, using the gifts, and if He gives you great gifts, certainly your way will probably be better. You will make more money, you will live better, you will have a nicer house, better car, etc., 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 etc. Or maybe your children will, and maybe they won't do anything for it. This is not necessarily always a bad thing. I know we think of it that way, and I know we probably know people whose children have inherited wealth or even great wealth, and they're worthless or rotten. It doesn't have to be that way, and I know plenty of examples that are not that way. Right? And I certainly consider myself one of those examples. I certainly could never have earned money that I have today by being a pastor. There's no way. No way at all. I know that, and I don't fool myself in that. I inherited a big chunk of change, and I fully appreciate that and know that. But by the same token, I enjoy work and I enjoy my work. And so while I know guys who have inherited a great deal of money or whatever from a family and immediately quit their normal jobs and become full-time golfers or full-time fishermen or full-time hunters or whatever, I couldn't do that because that's not my psyche. The way I was raised, even my parents, my dad was very well off when he was growing up, and he worked very, very hard. So it's all in how you look at things, and so it's not impossible to be somebody who doesn't necessarily make their own way in the world 1,000%, and yet not totally ruined. But yes, God wants us to make our own way. God wants to depend upon ourselves. And what else about that making a living? What's the purpose of making a living? I should have added that. What's the purpose of making a living or working in the world? What's the purpose?
It seems like from the passages, it's not just to provide for yourself, but to provide for others.
Yeah, others. And the first, of course, would be your spouse, and your children would be next. And then, if you are so blessed or so inclined to have workers, obviously workers, and so on and so forth, either through their pay or through just room and board, if that's the way you tend to do it. That in the old days was fairly common. That's the way it worked. And of course it doesn't too much anymore, but it did, there's nothing wrong with that. And then others too would be, if somebody's there that needs the help, don't be shy about helping them out. Now we've talked about this many times in various classes here about the homeless and shopping cart folks and what I call the beautiful people who live on the streets and stand on the street corners and whatever. And just to review, we know that in most cases, and I'm not being 100% here one way or another, but in most cases it doesn't do a whole lot of good. Matter of fact, it usually does harm to just give handouts to those people. Over the decades, especially since the Second World War, when vagrancy laws no longer are enforced, well, since the 60s anyway, vagrancy laws are no longer enforced, work camps no longer exist for such people, for vagrants, so it has become kind of second nature to people to just assume that these people are down on their luck and well, gee, if not for the grace of God, there go I, and so on and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, after a lot of research by many people over many years, we find that of course is not the case. It's the case that the people just don't want to work, don't like to work, have all kinds of excuses why they don't want to work, and in many cases make out much better than working people through their drifting or in getting handouts. And so the general rule, I always tell people when people ask me questions like that, the general rule I give them is no, you don't give them anything money-wise. If you're going to give them something at all, you give them food that they can eat right there on the spot, which most of them don't, but some will take. You certainly don't give them cash. You can give them maybe a debit card or something like that, certainly that they have to use at the grocery store. But even then, they're going to many times wind up buying Muscatel or whatever, or other things that aren't good for them. I mean, Twinkies are just as bad as Mad Dog 2020 in many cases, for them anyway. So the general rule is no, you're going to give them something. You can give them food, that's fine, if you want to do that. Understand that probably won't be appreciated. It probably is not going to make a whole lot of difference. Better thing to do is to contribute to organizations and institutions that these people will sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes go to for help. That's the better thing to do. And we used to be such an institution here until we got wiped out twice. All the groceries were taken in one fell swoop 2 times. After that, I said, no more. I'm not doing it anymore. So we just don't have the room for storage, and we don't have the people to watch it, 12 hours a day or whatever. And so I tell people, don't feel bad about giving a Vincent St. Paul, even though it's a Roman church institution. Don't feel bad about giving the Salvation Army, even though it's barely Christian these days. Don't feel bad about contributing to those kinds of places. Because again, God has allowed them to exist so that we can, through them, in a safe and a sane way, be giving sometimes to others. So that's kind of where that stands. What are the various ways of stealing that man has invented? Taxes. Yeah, confiscatory taxes. Yes. There is no question that taxes have been around as long as governments have been around. And God has directed us numerous times in the Bible that we should pay our taxes. And there are good taxes and there are bad taxes. And most of the taxes that we pay today are bad taxes. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that, first of all, taxes in the United States, since we're citizens of the United States, we can talk about that. Taxes in the United States are bad for 3 reasons. First of all, they're bad because they literally go against the Constitution. And there is some talk about, if they pass an amendment to amend the Constitution, then they're not unconstitutional anymore. Well, that may be. But the fact of the matter is that numerous amendments to the Constitution were found to be unconstitutional before they got very far. In other words, they were taken to the courts, and the courts determined that they were not something that the Constitution could be amended to. And that should have happened with this amendment. The fact that it didn't, there's all kinds of reasons for it. The second reason that our taxes are bad in the United States is because they are confiscatory. That is, that they take a great deal of money away from certain people and give it to other people. So confiscatory means you confiscate something, and then in other words, you can use another way. You could talk about wealth redistribution, which is the last question here, which is not approved of by God, does not have God's blessing. That is akin also to stealing. If God wanted to have those people to have that money, He would have seen to it that they could have it. For the government just to decide that somebody making less than a certain amount of money deserves a big chunk of your money by themselves without asking you, basically, that's wrong. Okay? So the confiscatory redistribution idea is wrong. And the third reason that our taxes are very often wrong is the things that they provide for people. And abortion is just the tip of the iceberg. There's certainly all kinds of other improper things that is done with our taxes. Now, here, of course, you will probably get into a lot of political opinion, and that's understandable. I think if we talk about the defense program, however, and knowing most of you are veterans or one kind or another, or maybe you work for the defense establishment, shall we say. The point of the fact is that we decided once before, back when we were talking about the fourth and fifth commandments, we decided that offensive wars were not God-pleasing. And that's just about the only kind of war that we've been involved in since the blowing up of the Maine in Havana Harbor, which was not done by the Cubans or the Spanish. But anyway, that's another story. We have been a war hawk nation for now more than 120 years, and I, for one, don't approve. I don't approve. Like I said, you can build all the battleships and all the aircraft carriers you want. I don't care. That I don't care about. You can take up 50% of the budget for military, and I don't care. Doesn't bother me one bit, one way or another. But like a perfect example this past week. Did you catch it? Did you catch the example this past week? President Biden sent an airstrike to Syria. And this is the exact same guy who said a year ago that this was foolhardy and reckless and everything else. And he even made the comment that the United States has no business going around bombing other sovereign nations. Hello? Well, you know, but as soon as people get into power, of course, this is what happens. It never fails.
You gotta figure he's trying to figure out how to bring the economy up, and the Democrats, put us back into another war. I don't know, what's the F-35 is the latest one. How much is that? $1 billion a piece? Something like that? Not quite that much. Half a billion? 500 million? 300 million? 200 million? Okay. 200 million clip for an F-35. How much more back does he want the economy to come? I mean, come on. That's kind of crazy. It's like the last aircraft carrier that went out. You know, it's been on sea trials now for more than a year, and it still can't function. You still haven't got the electronic catapults to work well. And there's some talk about replacing them with the old-fashioned steam catapults instead of electromagnetic things. It's like the rail guns. They put the rail guns on the Zumwalt, okay? And they had to take them off because there was no ammunition for them because they couldn't get the stupid things to work. This is crazy, folks. This is just nuts. So the things that our taxes are spent on, and I'm sure you've seen, stories and you've read stories about the, $20,000 toilet seat, and that kind of stuff. And that's just typical government overrun kind of thing. But studying the snail darters in the Sacramento River Delta, and you and I both know, you guys are pretty politically astute, and I'm sure you read some of this stuff. You know the absolute complete waste that your money is put to. And in many cases, again, not just waste, but immoral, unethical, improper. So for those reasons, we wince when we follow God's direction to pay our taxes. And there's nothing wrong with paying as little as you can get away with. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Okay? Nobody, and I mean nobody. My brother is a CPA, and probably one of the better ones in the world. The tax codes are many volumes, and he does not even understand. I mean, he understands the business portion, but there's a lot of other stuff that he doesn't really. He farms it out to somebody else when he's running a family business. So they make it that way on purpose. You can get into a lot of trouble without even knowing it. You can break all kinds of tax laws without having a clue as what you're doing. And sometimes even your preparers don't always have a clue. This is why a lot of these people charge $200, $250 an hour, okay? Because they have to know this stuff, and they have to go to class every year to keep up their licenses and stuff like that. And the laws change every year. So don't feel bashful. Don't feel bad if you're using a few loopholes here and there. You're whatever. I guarantee you this. I guarantee you this. This much I can guarantee you. Okay, and this is not a political opinion. This is a human nature opinion. Okay, I can guarantee you that you're paying more than you should. Even when you take all the loopholes that you can find, right? I guarantee you're still paying more than you want to. All right, unless you're like me for many years. When I had 5 kids living at home, and my church couldn't afford to pay me, so I was substitute teaching. Many years, I didn't pay anything because the government declared that I was too poor to pay anything.
I know people who give staff more in taxes than they ever pay in.
Yeah. Well, and there were a few years where I didn't pay in anything, and I still got money back, and I was shocked when that happened. I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, where did this come from? And then, I talked to about people. I said, maybe I should give it back. I remember one accountant said to me, I said, well, can I send it back? Because I don't really deserve this. I didn't earn this money, And I said, he said, well, what would you do? I said, well, I'd send a letter back and I'd say, apply this to the, national debt. And he laughed. And he said, that wouldn't even be a molecule of an atom of a cell, of a drop, of a drip in a bucket in the universe. So he said, he said, nice thought, Pastor, but don't bother. It's wasted. Oh, okay, all right. So we invent all kinds of ways. Taxes is one of them. Socialism is another one. It's a political way. Socialism is a way of stealing from one to give to the other. Communism, of course. Some people will ask, well, what's the difference between communism and socialism? My dad always used to say that socialism smiles as they steal from you or pick your pocket or club you in the head. The communists don't. Communists have no sense of humor. At least socialists have a sense of humor, although looking at Bernie, you would not know that. I think Bernie's probably more communist than the outside. But yeah, socialism. A lot of political systems, okay, or forms of political systems. There aren't really that many. But forms of political system are really forms of stealing. And the stealing usually goes one of two ways. The stealing either goes from people who have to people who haven't. And the people that do the stealing take their cut. Right? Or the stealing goes from people who don't have, who have, to people who have even more. And the people that have get fewer and fewer. Those are the two. And you can think of it this way, historically speaking. Think of a monarchy. Think of the king who already has a lot, right? And then he decides to raise taxes. Let's say, calls it. It's not really even government taxes. It's just to pay him and his family. So he does it, and he says to the serfs, you have to now give 50% of your crop. And of course the serf says, well, if I give you 50% of my crop, then I can't live. I can't feed my family, and I can't make any money to put repairs on my little thatch hut, and so on and so on. And say, well, okay, you can work for me then. And you turn your land over to me, and then I won't have to worry about it. And then all you have to do is give me, instead of 50%, all you have to do is give me 20%. And then when I go to war with the king next door, then you have to give me 6 months of service. And that, my friends, is how serfdom was created in Europe. Well, anywhere it was created, whether it's China or anywhere else. That's how it happened. The rich actually got richer, and the poor became landless. They became serfs. They became peasants, or peones, as they call them down in Mexico. So that was that's the monarchy way. And not all monarchies did that, of course, but most of them did in various forms. And then the other way, of course, is our political system today, where the people get very rich in taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. The poor wind up getting pennies on the dollar, and the people in the middle, the bureaucrats and the paper pushers, pencil counters, and the paperclip vendors, they all get very wealthy and they have jobs for life and so on and so on and so on. So that's the other way it works. That's the only two ways it works in history. I can tell you, as a student of history, I haven't seen a third option really work out. So there's all kinds of ways to steal from people and make it look right. And we can talk about, yeah, go ahead. Yes, yes, right, and yes, thank you for ripping me off. And of course, there's all kinds of ways of cheating too. There's all kinds of business programs that are inherently dishonest and inherently really stealing. I mean, there's if you look at the cost of some things, the actual raw materials, even the actual labor that's put into it, and then see what people make for those items. It's astronomical. It really is astronomical. Some profits are really gouging, are really what we call price gouging. About the only thing I can think of that's not. No, really, I can't say that yet. I was going to say produce because I know a lot about that, but there are a lot of people in the middle there in the produce business that make out like bandits. Literally like bandits. I can remember standing as a young kid at my grandfather's packing house many years ago. This was in the mid-'60s, and I was maybe 10 years old, not even 10 years old. I was working at the packing house, and he called me over, and we were watching boxes go by, 40-pound cartons of lemons, watching them go by. And he was going to give me a lesson that day, so he said, Stevie, he says, see all those boxes? I said, yeah, and I looked and they were stacked way high. Forklifts were taking them to big semi-trucks, thousands and thousands and thousands. And he said, how much do you think we make on each one of those boxes? And I looked at him and I said, gee, I don't know. He drove a pretty nice big Buick those days, and so I thought, $1, you know. Well, so did his wife, by the way, my grandmother. He had a black Buick, she had a white Buick. That's the only two colors of the cars they ever had, as I'm told that in their whole life, white and black, nothing else. Anyway, I said $1, and he laughed, and he said, no, try again. And I said, 75 cents or 60 cents or something, no. And I tried 3 or 4 more times, and finally he says, 1 nickel. 1 nickel box is what actually comes back into our actual till when all is said and done. 1 nickel for every box. And the reason I say that is that in the 90s, when I was at one of our meetings after my father retired, then I was put on the board, and so I was sitting in on one of the meetings, and my brother, who was running the company at that time, the CPA guy, and he was going through the numbers, and he said, well, we made a profit last year of 4.9 cents per box. And so after 30 years in the business, we were still making a nickel per box. Now, of course, when you're packing 5 million boxes, that's a lot of nickels, I will grant you. But still, and yet, if you go to the grocery store, here's the thing, the point I was trying to make, sorry, I got lost. The point I was trying to make is you go to the grocery store right down the street from that packing house, okay? You go to the grocery store, and lemons were 3 for $1. Okay? Now, let me tell you something, okay? In that box that we got 5 cents for, there are 110 lemons. That's why they're called, the size are called 110s, because you can get 110 of them into a carton. Okay? So the 110 lemons cost us basically a nickel. We got a nickel for it. The grocer, 3 of those lemons out of that box, okay, for $1. Now you tell me who made out like a bandit. And the wholesaler, I can tell you this, that the cartons, okay, carton price, if the carton price was ever over $25, we celebrated. Okay? Now again, multiply 110 times 33 cents. What are you going to come up with? You're going to come up with $300-something, right? Okay, so each of those boxes worth $300 to the grocer. Right? The wholesaler gets $25. We get a nickel. Now you can tell why there's so few farmers left in this country. All right. So how does God view then wealth redistribution? No, God sees it as stealing. That's what God sees it. As far as God is concerned, that's thievery. No, nothing more, nothing less. Now, let me also say that we cannot simply say all welfare is wealth distribution and therefore against God's will. Can't say that. There were in the original welfare rules written many years ago some very good instances, some very good intentions, I should say, and things, if they had been done differently, and if they had been controlled properly, then it would be fine. Nothing wrong with it. But the way it's been run over the years, again, human nature takes over, sinful lust takes over, and they don't work. And that's why when Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty in 1965, that war is still going on, and we're losing more every day. And when you hear the people on the TV, the liberals especially, talking about there are more poor people now than there were before, in a sense, that is correct. Now, in another sense, it's not correct, of course, because they all have cell phones and color TVs. But that's a whole other discussion.
Cadillac Escalades.
Huh?
Cadillac Escalades.
Well, some of them, yeah, that's true.
Well, I remember a fellow that this was in '86. He came here from Oklahoma. Got government contract out here on post. He was driving a brand new Chevy pickup. His wife was driving a Cadillac. They walked in the grocery store and they paid for everything with food stamps.
That is not an unusual story. Not an unusual story. Lesson 11, 8th commandment. Here we're talking about a good name of people. A lot of people call this the gossip commandment, and I guess you could certainly call it that. In any case, it's a commandment having to do with people's reputations and how we talk about people and how people talk about us. So, with that in mind, let's look at a couple of Solomon's Proverbs. First of all, Proverbs 11. Kurt?
He who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy conceals the matter.
All right, so we do not want to be a tale bearer. Now, it's an interesting translation there. The fact that the translation decided to use tale instead of another word for a report or story or whatever. But a tale bearer is, I think we can kind of get an idea of what the scriptures are talking about there. Huh? How false? In other words, is it 100% false? No, most of the time it's not 100% false. What do you when you think of a tale? What do you think of?
It's like a fairy tale.
Like a fairy tale, right? Okay, so there in almost every fairy tale, the literature gurus will tell you this, whether it's Grimm's, fairy tales, or whether it's Aesop's, or whether it's Arabian Nights, or whatever it is. In most of these fairy tales, there is a what? There is an element of truth. Sometimes there's an elephant of truth, and sometimes there's an element of truth. It could be anywhere in between. Okay, so the only point that I think the scriptures want is that something in here is not correct, and it doesn't have to be big incorrect. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be necessarily a fact that's wrong. It could just be what? What sometimes takes the place of a boring old fact?
An exaggeration.
I like that. Exaggeration. Okay, so somebody exaggerated. I like this one real well. Mostly because I know I can spell it. Hyperbole. In other words, hype. So and so got a ticket yesterday. I saw them. I passed them on the highway as I was heading towards Fry. I passed a friend of ours, or a former, let's say, a member, as I was going down the road, and off to the side there with the highway patrol, he was stopped, and that's a fact. Okay, but maybe when you tell it to somebody is George. Boy, I saw George. He got pulled over. He must have been going 90. You see? Now maybe he was only going 70 in the 45 miles.
Maybe you only got one.
But you see, the story's a lot better, right? If you got George going 90 than if you got George going 55 or 60 in a 45, right? Because that's boring. That's boring. Who cares about that story? Right?
You didn't haul him out of the car and throw him up against the wall. It's just we love excitement. We love attention. We love to know something nobody else. Hey, what I heard, right? And so these things could be only a very, very tiny percent false. It's just a little bit, right? And it doesn't even have to be necessarily, the fact doesn't necessarily have to be wrong. It can just be hyped, just be kind of, exaggerated. That's all right? Proverbs 19.
A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will not escape.
Okay. In other words, you will not skip the comeuppance. I mean, it's got to. What do we say? What goes around comes around, right? And we see this work out many times. People who are addicted to this kind of talk very often become the subject of this kind of talk. Okay? In other words, people who don't care about anybody else's reputation, very often their reputation goes down the hill. Okay? Luke 6. Go ahead, Kelly.
Do not judge, and you will not be judged. And do not condemn, and you will not be condemned.
All right. This one is, of course, a very famous passage. It's thrown at us all the time when we talk about homosexuality, or we talk about abortion, or we talk about socialism, or no matter what we talk about, we get blasted with this. Okay. Who's speaking here? Jesus, all right? And who's he talking to? Well, this is not the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, that's in Matthew. So who is he speaking to here? We have to go back a little bit.
Or his disciples.
Anybody else around? No? Okay. Well, then, this is analogous, certainly, to what he said in his Sermon on the Mount. But the point is, when he's telling people not to judge, he, of course, is God. And God can judge all he wants. And how does God judge today? How does God judge today? Real simple, real easy. Right here. Black and white. Black letters on white pages, usually. And just what we're talking about, that you shall not do this, you shall not do that. Do you know what that is, folks? This is judging. The 10 Commandments are judging. Surprise, surprise. Shock and amazement. Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Plain. Both of them. Judging. Many of the parables. Judging. Jesus does tons of judging. Jesus points at the Pharisees and calls them serpents, sons of Satan, whitewashed graves, sepulchres, thank you, and all kinds of stuff, okay? He does a ton of judging, and guess what? He is what? He is more than allowed. He's permitted to do that. God is permitted to do that, all right? So, and what's the key word here? The key word is, which we kind of lose in translations today. Why? Because the old translations, judge ye not, right? Lest ye be judged. Okay? Many translations today, not all of them, but a lot of the more popular ones, they don't have, the you is unspoken, which grammatically that's fine. Okay. It's a recognized part of grammar that you can have the you unspoken. But it's kind of nice. In this one in particular, it's kind of nice. You as opposed to God. So our answer to people, when they say you're judging about this person or that person or this sin or that sin, our answer is very simple. We are not judging. God is. We let God do the judging. And it's always wise to do that. We cannot read hearts. Okay? That is not possible for us. We can read actions, and God allows us to make certain assumptions about certain actions. Okay? That's all right. But again, that's God's allowance in those cases. So, this is an important passage that gets misused and abused horribly. John 8. Yes, ma'am.
You are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning, and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him.
Yep.
Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies.
There you go. Now that he's talking about Satan, and he's talking to the Pharisees. Right? He's talking to the Jewish leaders. And so this is, again, just as we were talking about before, this is a lot of judging, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is a lot of judging. This is big time judging. Absolutely. But again, you can read hearts. He knows what he's talking about. And I like some translations I like real well that talk about this as when Satan speaks, he talks lies, he speaks his native tongue. I like that. I like that. That's his native tongue. That's his language. Okay. And many people would argue with that point that Satan speaks nothing but lies. Isn't it true that Satan says truths, but he says truths out of context, shall we say? Yeah, he's a talebearer. Well, not only that, but like when he quoted the Psalms to Jesus, he said, "Well, go ahead and jump because the angels will bear you up." Quote right out of God's word, right? Since Jesus was quoting God's word to him, he figured, "Well, okay, well, I can quote God's word too. The devil can quote the Bible just as well as Jesus can." Sure enough, okay. So he did. That's okay. They'll hold you up so you won't dash your foot against a stone. And isn't that true? Yeah, that's true. Isn't that
prophesied of the Messiah in the book of Psalms? Yeah, certainly was. So did he say the truth? Well, yeah, in that sense he did. But what was he using it for? Yeah, he was using it against God. Okay? And that's what happens a lot of times today with false teachers in false churches, is they use God's word against other parts of God's word. That's why Jesus came back with saying, don't put your God to the test. Now, this brings up a whole other subject, which is it a matter of judgment, shall we say, which piece of God's word is elevated above others? Is that a judgment call truly, or is that something that is determined? I think it's determined. How so? By whom, when, and where? By God's word. Okay. This is what we call a conundrum or a dilemma that many people try to project onto the Bible. Okay, I'll give you a couple of good examples, or one good example. Say the fifth commandment. Okay, the fifth commandment says not to kill or harm. Okay? The seventh commandment says not to lie. Okay? The Indians come to your door. Fine. And your friendly, or not so friendly, American indigenous native. And we have a policy of taking all the women in this area and raping and killing them. That is our tradition. That is just what we do. Okay, and so I must ask you, do you have any women in this house? And your wife is standing back there doing the dishes or whatever, or beating the rug or whatever. And you look at the nice indigenous American and you say, no, that's my brother. He just looks a little funny. He's got some lumps and bumps. So you lied. You broke a command. You lied. You sinned. Okay. Then you're going to defend that by saying, well, I couldn't allow her to be raped and killed, harmed. Okay? I couldn't allow that. What are you supposed to do? You have two commandments that are in entire conflict with each other. So who judges? And how and why and when and where do we judge? Do we decide which commandment we're supposed to follow? What are we supposed to do? So here, I know a truth about you. You're a liar and a skunk. You're a cheat. And anybody makes a bargain with you, if somebody in the congregation wants to borrow, or you come to them and you say, I want to borrow $100, I know for a fact, from past hearing, I've known you for 40 years, and you've never paid anybody back, ever. You're one of those borrower people that you don't ever pay back, and I know that. Okay? But of course, I'm not just going to say, oh, he very seldom pays anybody back. I'm going to say, he never ever paid. He is a skunk and a lousy jerk and whatever. In other words, you're going to break the 8th commandment. But if you don't break the 8th commandment, then you're going to allow him to break the 7th. And your neighbor is going to wind up on the wrong end of the stick. What do you do? What do you do? Some pastors like to do this to their confirmation classes. They call them can of squirms. That was a big popular thing when I was in seminary. Have your students come up and pick a piece of paper out of a coffee can and read it to the class, and then have the class erupt in total chaos. And you don't have to teach the class for the next hour. Anyway, this is commonly proposed by atheists, agnostics, Bible bashers of all kinds to people, saying, so what are you supposed to do? You got two commandments that seem to be in conflict with each other. How do you figure that out? Suzanne is going to give us the perfect answer.
You know, like to have a situation.
Oh, okay.
During World War II, this was very, very, very common with people hiding Jews and people coming.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Because they did not want them harmed, so they lied about having them.
Sure. Sure. Great. Exactly.
And they had a dilemma.
I have numerous friends over the years. You know, I had one guy I knew not that well, but I knew him in Flagstaff who he stopped paying his taxes for that reason. He stopped paying his taxes because I am not going to support abortion. And these were the days when Planned Parenthood was getting a pretty good chunk of change from the government. And yeah, well, and he said, I'm not gonna participate. I refuse. And he said, I can't in good conscience do that. Right? And he got away with it for a long time. And he just went off the grid, totally. But anyway, they finally caught him, but after a couple of decades on that. So this is a common problem that people throw up to Christians all the time. There is, by the way, an answer. There is an answer. Yes. Okay, good. I'm not going to make that number one, but I'm going to, yeah. Your conscience, of course, and the reason I'm not going to make it number one is your conscience can be wrong. But St. Paul reminds us not to go get, he said, as Luther said, okay, Luther, Diana of Worms, okay, he said, it is neither safe nor right to go against one's conscience. And that was pretty much, when he said that to the emperor and the Pope's representatives, he knew he wasn't going to get an argument. Nobody argued with him on that point. They argued with him on his doctrines, of course. But they did not argue with him on that point. That was a very well-known and pretty much accepted, almost, with a few exceptions. It was pretty much accepted across the board. You said, my conscience tells me I got to do this, and I don't have a choice. People understood that. They may not agree with it, but they understood it. Okay, so conscience is an answer. What's a better answer? Or I wouldn't say necessarily a better answer, but this applies. This can apply straight across the board 100%. I'm not sure that the first one applies 100%, but it's really simple, folks. What's the most important thing in existence? Prayer. Okay? So effect on faith. Okay? So, for example, if I tell the indigenous individual, that my wife is standing back there and they go get her and kill her, I have cut short her time of grace. Whether I think she's a believer or not, that I don't know. Might not be. She might come to faith the next time the preacher comes to town. Or the next time we kneel down next to the old bed and pray. The Holy Spirit might bring her to faith. I don't know that. I have no idea. See, I can't judge that. I can't tell. I can assume, sure, and yeah, we do a lot of times, and that's okay. It doesn't hurt anything. But I dare not cut her time of grace, sure. And so lying to the Indian is not going to cut his time of grace short. It's not going to cut my time of grace short. It's only going to cut her time of grace short. And I can't do that. Simple. So again, I'm not sure that it fits every single solitary situation, but in general, always let grace prevail, and faith and salvation. That's the other thing I would say. Okay? Does this impinge
Does this impinge on a person's salvation? Does this endanger a person's salvation? See, that's the idea. That takes primary over everything else. Now, it wouldn't if we could read hearts, but we can't. So because we can't read hearts, we have to give this top billing. And then a lot of times when it comes to ourselves, because we know we're believers, okay? God encourages us to know that. Then our conscience. That's why I say it comes in second. And also because the conscience could be misdirected. Conscience can be taught. You can teach. You can teach, and we see this in the world. You can teach children to be cannibals. You can teach young people to be polygamists. And you can teach them, you can convince them that it's absolutely right. You can convince people of a lot of things. You start young enough. Okay? I don't know, who was it said? Give me kids at 2 or whatever. Or I forget who it was, but
That'd be harder to change than adults.
yeah, right. Well, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, kind of thing. Don't let people box you all up with these scorns. Okay, they're really not that hard. They're really not, because like I said, almost every case, one of these two things can come into play fairly easily, and you can solve it. You can solve the puzzle.
I understand, or I was taught that we knew right from wrong, conscience was.
Yeah.
Even though we was not taught anything.
Well, yeah. Well, sure.
We know right from wrong.
Yeah.
And
You know right from wrong. If no time else, and I don't know that we can speak of other time else, but at your baptism, especially if you're baptized as an infant, or if you are brought to faith as an infant, as some in the Bible were before their baptism, then you certainly know right from wrong. Because what is contained in baptismal faith? All kinds of knowledge, tons of knowledge. We don't really even know what's contained in it. We do know there's some miraculous things in there. Why? Well, what do you have to know in order to be saved? You have to know the 2 natures of Christ. You have to know the resurrection. You have to know the virgin birth. You have to know the resurrection. You have to know the Trinity. Okay. Well, let's just keep it with this thing with the Trinity. You have to know the Trinity in order to be saved, right? Right. And so, if you're brought to faith 2 months before you're born, or at the baptismal font when you're 2 days old, do you know the Trinity? Do you believe the Trinity?
Yeah.
According to the Bible, you do. Because Jesus said of these little babies, they who believe in me. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, he meant me as the second member of the Holy Trinity. Okay? And the God-man, Jesus Christ. Okay? So, if he said that of those little children, and we know that certainly was true of John the Baptist before he was born, and certainly was true of Jeremiah and Isaiah before they were born, and maybe others too, depends on how you read some of these things, but it's very clear. And so, yes, if they know the truth, let's put it this way: if that individual knows the Trinity, does he also know right from wrong?
well, he knows right from wrong, even though he has nothing to do with religion.
That's right. Well, I don't know if I would say that, because in the end, everything has to do with religion.
I know, but
Everything is spiritual.
without a person being exposed to.
Okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about. This was a big debate.
This is a natural.
Well, yeah, this was a big debate a long time ago. The whole tabula rasa idea, which was the idea was spoken around, and it's still believed by a lot of people, that human beings come into this world, whether you're talking about conception or birth, either one, human beings come into this world with a blank slate. They don't know anything. They are completely amoral. They have no understanding of good, evil, bad, rotten, wicked, whatever. None. Rousseau, the great philosopher Rousseau, was one of the ones, among others, who promulgated this, and it got to be incredibly popular. And by the way, this is why our justice system is as messed up as it is today, because of Rousseau. Rousseau believed that it was environment that caused people to rob, steal, kill, whatever. It was environment. They were raised wrong. They were taught wrong. Okay, it was their environment, their parents, or they had no parents. They grew up on the streets, or whatever. And he said, "There's the problem." Up until him, crime and punishment was just that. You commit a crime, you get punished. And the punishment was two things. Punishment was A, restitution of some kind, and B, it was deterrence. And the deterrence, by the way, was not necessarily that you wouldn't do it again. In other words, that you didn't want to go back or whatever. It was at that time that you wouldn't be allowed to because you weren't out free in public. And people forget this. The purpose of capital punishment, originally, the purpose of capital punishment was not so that the news would get out, so that you would have a hanging or a beheading, and people would see it and go, "Oh, gee, I don't want that to happen to me, so I won't kill my neighbor." That was not the original purpose of capital punishment. The original purpose of capital punishment was so that that individual who is hung does not do the same thing to somebody else. That completely changed eventually as time went on. Anyway, the prison system changed entirely. If you go back east, you'll find a lot of prisons. Well, you can go to Yuma too, see the old territorial prison. Look at the difference between prisons built in the early 1800s to mid to late 1800s, maybe even like 1870, 1880, and prisons built in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and on like that, and especially ones built since then, in the 50s and 60s. Huge difference. If you look at the ones built first, you see that they look like castles. They look like dungeons. They look very formidable. They're stone, and they have gates and bars, and they look like a medieval fortress. That's what they look like. Okay? And they do not look like a pleasant, fun place. Right? Then you look at the ones that were built in the middle, and they're they're still foreboding, but not quite as foreboding. But they still got really high walls, and they still got searchlights and guard towers and all this kind of. Now look at the ones that have been built since then. And
Country club.
they're very open, a lot of open space, wire fences, no big giant stone fences or metal fences or anything like that. What happened was those two reasons, restitution and deterrence from the individual who's suffering or imprisoned, okay, were replaced. Restitution still there a little bit, but not much really, because we get restitution from somebody who broke in here 20 years ago. And, it's $20.33 or something like that. And at that rate, I will be long dead by the time he finally pays off his so it's a joke. It's really kind of a silly joke. But anyway. So restitution is still there. But the other thing is gone. We're not punishing that person. Oh no. We are rehabilitating them. We're going to give him a law degree. We're going to make him a teacher, or we're going to make him a scientist, or we're going to make him a biologist. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, and so he's going to learn from his other buddies how to hotwire a car, but he'll be able to defend himself in court then. He can do both. Right? So that all changed because of the idea that we come into this world as a blank slate. Okay? Just blank, nothing on it. And we are impacted by our environment. By our parents fighting and arguing in the room next door,
by our brothers and sisters picking on us, by bullying in the neighborhood, by what we see on TV, by what we play in video games, and all that stuff. All of that has more to do with us than anything taught in here. And because of that, then it's not their fault. Oh my goodness, it's not their fault. They didn't do anything wrong. Right? They didn't help. They can't help it. Right? You know, when you talk about welfare and the ghetto and everything, people say, "Well, they can help it. They've never had the opportunity. They've never had a father come home from work. So the only work they know that their mother does is prostitution." And so you can't blame them for being messed up. There's a certain amount of truth to that, but as Harry said, we're not blank slates when we come into this world. We know what we are. We're conceived as sinners. And don't sinners know right from wrong? You bet you they do. You bet you they do. Now, we might not always know when we're wrong, but that's a lack of knowledge. That's ignorance. And ignorance is no defense, as any cop will tell you. Well, I didn't know the speed limit changed. Too bad. Get out of luck. All right, well, let's get to this last passage.
One other comment. When a baby is brought into the world, you don't have to teach them anything bad. You have to teach them everything good.
That's bull.
100% true. Because you watch a little child, you see what they do.
Well, you know, I used to say this all the time in sermons and classes and stuff. My wife would get mad at me, but I was there for the birth of all 5 of our kids, every single one. And she would always get mad. When she used to come to class, she'd raise her hand. So was I. Big deal. Anyway, she was involved with other things. She was doing other stuff. But the thing that I noticed in every single case, okay, every single case, the thing that I noticed was the greedy little boogers that they were. Right? You know, immediately, whether they're under the warming lamp or they're on my wife's belly, it's give me something, feed me, feed me. Hey, I'm cold, I'm hungry, I'm wet, feed me, and just making just an absolute irritant of themselves. Anyway, that's what I noticed, among other things. All right, James 4. Okay, go ahead.
Do not speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against the brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge of it.
Yeah, and good luck with that. Okay, a judge is supposed to be keep the law perfectly. Right? You don't want a judge who's breaking the law all the time. And that's just the way of James saying, good luck with that. If you think you're going to be that way, if you think you're perfect, fine, be a judge. But if you know, don't be that way unless you've got a clean clock yourself. Right? What is God saying here in this commandment about truth and lies? Simply put, well, how would you put it?